Welcome to Resilience Gone Wild. We just had the most incredible conversation with Lyssa DeHart, who is an expert in listening and metaphors and lighting up your brain. And I just had the best time.
Talk about energy. I think Lyssa showed up 15 minutes early and just started going. We actually had to stop her because she was giving away all the good stuff without even being recording. So I'm so excited for you listeners to hear this conversation. Deep dives into metaphors. This is kind of the first time I'm hearing that background, because I know, Jessica, you've taken part in classes where you've kind of learned these concepts. That's the case?
Yeah.
Gotcha. And, and I think some of the things I pulled from that was like how we can rely on our own natural experiences, but natural as in nature, right? Like, it's right there in front of us, and those metaphors are there. And the one that leaped out to me most relevant was you cross a river by feeling the stones. And my wife and I were crossing a river while feeling stones as we were flying home from a wedding Sunday with our 1-year-old, because you can imagine that river, starting to cross that river begins sometimes days before, right? Because of the anxieties, you're getting ready. And yes, have you ever seen the toddler having a meltdown at the gate, Jessica?
Yes, I've had them and I've seen them. And to your point, like the whole metaphor, the whole story that can go through your head, instead of having the freak out experience of the moments of the child having a tantrum and how hard it is when everything falls out of the stroller and whatever else it is. Mm-hmm. If you actually can process like the slippery moss and the beautiful flowing river and the cold, like all of it, it just brings so much more joy to life.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it brought a smile to my face when I heard that metaphor. I was like, wow, if I would have had that in my pocket while we were traveling what seemed like for an eternity on Sunday just to get home, it would have helped a lot. It really would have,
I was thinking of you when we were talking about education and relationships with parenting and children, mm-hmm. and you and Miles, right. He's not there yet to have those deep conversations, but, this is a great, really informative to parents to think about the conversations you have, mm-hmm. and how you listen both ways, that will serve you well for years to come, for later conversations with teenagers and all that.
Absolutely. So, I mean, again, your guys are going to get into that and more. So should we get to the episode?
Awesome.
All right. Enjoy, everybody.
I am so excited to have Lyssa DeHart here with me today. Lyssa was a huge influence on my journey into Resilience Gone Wild. She introduced me to the power of metaphors through her formal certification program called, Coaching with the Power of Metaphors. Thank you so much, Lyssa, for joining us.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. Really happy you invited me, Jessica. Thank you.
Yay. I love spending time with you. So this is amazing. I get to share you with everyone else.
Mutual admiration.
Yay. So tell us what's coming up for you, like around this whole metaphor love of yours and nature and my path that you led me on.
Oh, and the path that I led you on. Well, I mean, I think when you think about people, and I mean this just cross-culturally, cross-globally, it really doesn't matter where you come from or what your country of origin is or your culture of origin is. The reality is every human being on this planet started off fundamentally in a small group of people moving through nature. And so the way that we conceptualize things is often through the lens of nature. And so if we conceptualize idea containers, which is what I think of as metaphors, or these idea containers, we'll take one idea, and in the case of nature, we would take the idea of a deeply rooted tree or a flowing river, like I want to be in flow. That idea of flow comes from the metaphor coming out of a natural experience of being around water, typically, mm-hmm. right? And so these things are just common in the way that we conceptualize the world around us, even though we've added other metaphors into the mix that aren't necessarily nature-based. Many of our most powerful metaphors that we use as human beings across the planet do have to do with some sort of experience of nature or the observance of nature or are navigating through nature.
Yeah, it's so interesting because you opened this world up to me, and there are these categories of metaphors, and nature is a huge one. And then there's some, and I think of nature metaphors, even if you're talking about a storm or, some sort of dark happening in nature, it's real. Yeah. And then there are other ones in categories that I try to avoid. I literally try to avoid, like war. There's this whole category that we've added as humans, like this category of explosions and wars, and you could talk more about that or the other categories if you want. But, my offering here is to say, we speak in metaphors, we think in metaphors. If you actually record yourself, like we all did in your class, and you listen or record someone else, it's amazing how many words and how many phrases and how many thoughts are actually words that have way deeper meaning, that come from something else and create an image in our head. And it's been a beautiful thing to be able to make the choice of the language I use.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting, honestly, I think it was you who brought to my attention the Sapir Whorf theory, yeah. And the idea of how we discuss things or talk about things impacts how we perceive solutions. And so in that particular case, when I think they used the idea of looking at crime, and they used crime and they talked about it in the frame of reference of crime is a virus or crime is a beast. And when we talked about crime as a virus, people's responses to the virus was to look for what are underlying things that are causing this virus. Like what are the antidotes to virus? What do we, more of like thinking about how do we heal a virus, right? Mm-hmm. Versus when we're thinking about it as a beast, well, then we're like, we must lock up wild beasts. And so the frame of reference shifted for the people who heard the difference in the language. And I think that what you just spoke to a moment ago is a really good example of this. We have a million metaphors for, notching your arrow or shooting straight or whatever the kind of more warlike or fighting like metaphors might be. On the other hand, it might not be such a bad metaphor. A person might not be using it in a negative way, but we also use other metaphors. And I think really fundamentally, I align personally more with the nature metaphors just because that's more of my bent. And yet these elements of language are so common. And I think the bigger thing is they're so common that we don't even recognize that they're metaphors. And we're just using them sort of just unconsciously, because that's how people use metaphors, unless they're writing a novel or they're writing poetry, where they might really sit and think about like, what's the right metaphor for the brush of a thought through the trees, right? And they've made this like kind of conceptual idea in their language. For clients, when I'm working with my clients and a client brings forward a metaphor, I remember having a conversation, I write about this in my book with one of my clients, and they were talking about writing a book themselves, and they were talking about needing to have steps. Well, here's a really, honestly, it's us in some sort of environment, right? So we're taking steps, and the metaphor that came, or the imagery that came to my mind was this idea of we're walking along a path, and she said, no. In China, we say you cross a river by feeling the stones. And if anybody has ever been in nature and had to either cross a stream or a river, you know that experience of like the water looks like it's not moving that fast, but it's actually got a great deal of strength behind it. Or the rocks are slippery because moss grows on them or whatever. And that sense of like having to be really thoughtful and careful about foot placement. This comes straight out of a natural experience, right? And then by using that, I said, is that what we're doing? Are we crossing a river? And she said, yes. She wasn't on a path. She wasn't on my path. She was on her own, which was this crossing of the river. And my invitation to her then was, what is the first stone we need to feel? And so we stayed with the metaphor that was alive in her brain. And I think it's a good example, if not even a great example, of how the metaphor comes to us based on maybe our frame of reference, but anybody who's been in a river can relate to that one.
And to add to that, this is not just a coaching conversation. This is a conversation, and this is a big part of what you teach people to listen more deeply and more directly, as opposed to adding all of their own stuff.
Yeah.
Right. Like instead of waiting to tell your story and waiting to respond, to actually super deep listening. So to not assume what the steps mean. If somebody says, because we talk in metaphor. If somebody tells you a story, one of the examples that came from one of our sessions in class with you was we were analyzing, a story, and I said I was struggling with something, and the person who was coaching me or talking to me saw struggle differently. Like they saw a different image of struggle, and they asked me what I was seeing so they could connect with me better. And my interpretation was sort of like a straitjacket and being tied up and that kind of struggle, versus what was in their head, which was a very different story. So, in terms of the way we communicate and the way we listen, to listen more carefully for what a step might mean.
Yeah.
And push off bringing our own imagery in to someone else's story is.
Yeah, I think it's really that idea. And I honestly think, I do it. I talk about this from teaching coaches and therapists about how to be in conversations. But then in my own practice where I'm working with people, I think of it as testing a hypothesis. There's nothing wrong with me saying, gosh, this image, if you don't mind, may I share an image that's showing up for me? And I say, I just sort of see you like wrestling with a tiger. And you go, no, it's not a tiger. It's a straitjacket that I'm experiencing. That's fine, because what's happened then is there's this sort of exploration going on. But I don't want to assume that this wrestling with a tiger is what is happening to you, which is sort of the hints, the sort of like, I'm seeing this path open up. What are you seeing? And giving the grace or the space to the other person to put their own meaning and interpretation of their own experience in words, and not asking them to then explain it to us, because we don't want to take people out of their flow. We want them to stay there, but it gives us a frame of reference then of how we're maybe holding a conversation. And I think this can happen in any conversation. It can happen in any conversation with your spouse, with your kids, with your friends, with a stranger. They use certain language. And as we use that language in reflection, not like I hear you saying da 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 da, but rather like, I was just looking at something online and somebody said something and they were using like words like magical and stuff like that. And I'm like, it does seem magical. And so it's this sense of being heard as well, which I think most of us in our lives, I don't know how many people can raise their hand and go, I feel very heard all the time by all the people in my life. Most of us, if there is truly an epidemic of loneliness, being heard is a huge deficit for most of us. And so to your point, this ability to really hear those words that are powerful and important to the person is crucial to that person actually feeling seen and heard.
To feed off something you just said, which brought up something really important to connect to this whole loneliness that is an epidemic of the day. Many things are very hard to talk about. They're hard to share. They're hard to explain without feeling shame and guilt and vulnerability. So, to have a conversation with someone who you might think is lonely, but not to set judgment out there of defining lonely as a negative, metaphor, and asking somebody how they feel through metaphor releases a lot of that fear. So can you talk to that? Because I had no idea when I met you that's like changed my life. So
yeah. So I mean, people like, especially when it comes to like, there's a huge distinction in many people's minds, experiential at any rate, of the difference between lonely and alone. Mm-hmm. Right? Like I can be happily alone for hours. In fact, my husband's out of town right now. And so I was alone last night. And that gave me an opportunity to really work on a couple of things that I just haven't gotten done. And so it didn't bother anybody that I was up until 9 o'clock working on something, right? The dogs were fine. I was fine. He was doing his own thing, so he was fine. But that aloneness wasn't a problem for me. So I think it really speaks to this idea of like asking people, but even more importantly is that people will often tell you, like the different and not make assumptions about what it is that they've told you, but rather get curious about those words. I'm trying to think like loneliness and alone isn't something that is really coming up strongly for me right now in the way that I'm conceptualizing how it might show up in a conversation. But I think a way that it might is when a client says, I'm really, really longing for more community. That might be a way that, I mean, community in that particular structure of a conversation it's a word, yes, but it's also a felt experience that a person is talking about, because it's not just any community. We could put people in a grocery store. Now they got a community of people in the grocery store. That's not the community that they're talking about. So when you say community, what is the experience of community that you're looking for? And at that point, you're really going to have the metaphors starting to show up. It's this interconnectedness of reliance on others, or this kind of symbiotic relationship that I have where I have people to talk to about things that are important to me, but I also feel like I've got somebody who has my back, right? So we start using a lot of language that is very metaphorical to start to explain this idea of what community means to us. And again, you don't have to be a coach or a therapist to do this, but as we start to elicit this deeper awareness of what that even means, people naturally are going to default to things like connected, and they have my back, and there's a safe space to explore ideas or a shared value. I mean, these are all metaphors, even though they're common language.
Yeah, and to just pursue it and say, what does a safe space look like to you?
Yeah.
What's coming up for me is the ability to actually have better conversations with kids. Like to open up, we have so much trouble, especially with boys, right? Like there's everyone that I know, or most people that I know, you should never say never, I never say always, have, raised teenage boys, and there was always a struggle for more than one word answers, right? like the depth of conversation, if you run with a metaphor and show that you actually heard the word, that they're offering, or a word that they're offering.
Yeah.
So,
I have some thoughts around parenting that, at least from my observations of parents and teenagers, is a couple of things. First is there's a developmental stage that all human beings go through called differentiation. And so the need to sort of create our own identity, because those same kids, if they're with their friends, have no trouble talking about stuff. And I think it also really speaks to how we have a power imbalance in relationships with our children. And so parents, often start off, I'm sort of the dictator of the family, what I say goes. And at some point, there isn't more of a give and take, and the kids don't feel that ability to have a different opinion or to challenge parents on ideas, then what ends up happening is they just have nothing to say. And so and I'm not saying that's 100%, but I do think there's something there to pay attention to. And I think, to your point, if what we started doing was listening to our kids, and I used to talk about this, I taught parenting in the military for 7 years. And I would always say, if you don't start talking to your kid when they're like 2, 3, 4, 5, and the head pops off their Barbie and they're upset, and you don't get down there and be like, yeah, that's really distressing. I know. What are we going to do to solve this? Like, and make it like a conversation and give value to what they're upset about when they're 5. By the time they're 15, good luck when you're trying to talk about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, because they're not going to be listening to you at this point because they haven't felt listened to. And I used to always use it is more of an analogy than a metaphor, but like the head pops off the Barbie and the kid is just like losing their mind over it, or the whatever, this will date me, Ninja Turtle, and that is something that is so upsetting to that kid. And the parent's like, it's not a big deal. We'll just put the head back on. It's not a big deal. Stop doing this. Like, I got stuff to do. And then
I'm on my phone. I've
got things. I'm busy. And then for the parent, somebody backs into them at the grocery store and they're like, oh my God, my bumper got scratched, and it's like, it's no different. The Barbie is just as valuable to that kid as your car is to you. And yet in some way in your mind, your stuff is more important. And I think that's a piece of it also, like how we listen to people and we honor where they are.
Yeah. I mean, it's so important. What you just said is so important in terms of recognizing that we all have different, very unique priorities and stories in our head and fears and all that. And to go sort of deeper with what does the story mean? If you if you have a fender bender and you freak out versus someone else freaking out, the story and the fear is likely very different. One person might be afraid of the cost. One might be afraid of the confrontation with the person because they're afraid of, violence. One might be about having to
You messed up my pretty
somebody.
car.
Right. I'm not going to have a car. I might have to rent something else. I'm going to have to tell somebody.
Insurance is going to get involved.
Right. Like all those things. And the same thing with the Barbie. Like we assume I can get you a new Barbie, but like there's so many levels of what that kid could be going through thinking. Like, what is the impact of a head being broken off a Barbie? Like, so just to have that conversation without assumptions and with care, with love. Yeah. Every sense for yourself and others.
Yeah. And I really think, if we're going to kind of circle back into this idea of nature,
thank you for doing that.
we have these attachments to things which come out of how we survive. And even though a Barbie doesn't, or like our dependence, so life dependence probably isn't attached to a Barbie fundamentally in a physical kind of way, it is emotionally. Right?
It's my friend, right?
It's my friend. And how much time do I spend playing with this thing? And so it is fun. We're a social species, and fundamentally it's a part of our social construct. And even though it's not a real tiger about to eat you, where you really probably do need to get up and get moving and maybe, do something, it's an existential threat to this sense of self and sense of community. I remember as a kid, I had so many stuffed toys. I loved stuffed toys, and I would put chairs in the hallway. This was back when parents could leave their children at home alone. And so nobody was in the house, and I would have like the chairs from the dining room set up, and I would put all my animals in all the chair seats except for one, and I would take them on drives. And it was this sense of a community that I had. And I'm sure, in retrospect, it had to do with the fact that I was also alone at home and we didn't have video games yet. So it was like, this was my way of creating a community so that I was safe.
Awesome. So on that note of being safe, can you talk a little bit about how our brain works around metaphors and how resilience connects with that? Because I think there's a connection with neuroscience and our brain and resilience.
Yeah. So, I was thinking about this question because you thankfully sent it to me. Metaphors connect with different structures in the brain. And when you look at metaphors from the framework of neuroscience, Lakoff and Johnson really started really exploring this idea of not just linguistically the metaphors, but really looking at how those things connected to the structures of our brain. And from an anthropological perspective, we have to be able to see the tiger from the tall grass, right? We needed to be able to be have visual acuity so that we could see danger within the environment. We were also moving through environments. Very few small tribes of people were stationary. That took, quite a bit of time before we started planting things and really staying stable. And then we are the most object manipulative species on the planet. And then there's also the sense of we need to eat to survive. And so the 4 conceptual metaphors really have to do with thinking is eating, thinking is seeing, thinking is moving, and thinking is object manipulation. And so you have these structures that are designed and developed within the brain that manage these activities in how we survive and move through the world. And as a result of that, when you start looking at metaphors, different metaphors will activate different regions of the brain. So when a client says something to the effect of, like, I can't see the forest for the trees would be a great example, right? And if you're a banyan tree, you've created your own forest because you put down all those roots.
So then your brain's all messed up.
Yeah, so you really can't probably see the forest for the trees. But it's also the metaphor of I need a different vantage point to take a look at this, because I'm lost in this ability to actually see a bigger picture. And
so I just want to stop for a second, process what you just said, because it's really so crazy interesting to me, and I would think a lot of people. We've evolved to have these 4 different regions of focus, right? So that we can navigate our world.
And I would
safely.
say there's more, but those are the 4 primary conceptual areas.
And they're in different parts of our brain. And with fMRI or MRI, like some brain technology, imaging technology, we actually have seen that if you use a metaphor that brings imagery of different ones of these, a different part of your brain lights up. That's pretty darn cool, I think.
Yeah.
And kind of new information out there I'm offering you guys, whoever's listening. So what's the impact of that? The fact that we're processing things in different parts of our brain.
Oh, and the one that I didn't even mention, which I think really fits into this idea of somatic metaphors, is that textures and hot and cold also light up different elements and not necessarily structures, but different places in the brain that are aligned with things. So if I say I'm having a really rough day, it's going to light up an area of my brain that has to do with texture and feeling things tactily. And so the reason I think this is important is that honestly, it means that these words are not disassociated from our experience. And that if I have a sense of saying, I'm having a really rough day, and as a therapist or a coach, you hear me say that, and as you say, rough day, what would you like your day to be like? And we start creating that kind of container of what is the directionality of this conversation going to be. I might say something, I'm not necessarily going to go with a polarity, like I want it to be smooth, but I might say, I'm really looking for more peace. What is the experience of peace? It might be that sense of floating in a river. So is that what we're doing? Moving from this rough day to this floating in a river? And I say, yes. Well, these things, these are the fact that my brain is lighting up, but it's also moving. The light is moving through my brain to different places as I'm making these connections and I'm verbalizing these connections to you. So one of the things that I think is brilliant about really learning to listen to people is that you're watching their brain at work come out their mouth. Right?
That's awesome. Yeah.
And how else, short of an MRI or, however it is people are like all the new technology, because fMRIs have issues as well. There's a lot of new technology on how we're looking at electrical patterns within brain waves and things like that. But that your brain is lighting up and moving around, you're listening to a person's brain at work if you're really listening to them.
And it's pretty wild because I think about when people say, think before you speak. And that certainly is associated, like when people aren't thinking before they speak, it's just actually talk to that if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I think there's places where we probably should think before we speak. It's sort of funny. Like I do a lot of assessments in coaching and I do a lot of mentor coaching. And what I'll hear is, in coaching and in therapy also, we talk about reflective listening and summary. And so you'll hear people going, so Jessica, I heard you say A, B, C, and D. Is that right? And this really does nothing for the conversation. This is the sort of conversation that we have when we're in a dangerous conversation with our spouse and we're likely to get into trouble. And so we want to be very careful. And at that moment, thinking before we speak is probably really important, right? If we're going to just like blow somebody out of the water with a truth bomb, speaking of war metaphors, we probably want to be careful, right? And maybe a bit more gentle in the way that we're having this conversation. But when people are speaking about what's important to them, when they're speaking about what they want to really work on and what is causing them challenges in their life and what they would like to be different, that is a place where people are using metaphors unconsciously. Mm-hmm. So they're not thinking before they speak. Their brain is working. It's not that their brain isn't doing stuff. Their brain is, though, pulling together ideas to try and explain what is important to them. Yeah, they're putting a story together, whatever that is. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's so important, because we're hearing the deeper underlying important story. And it gives us a place to our earlier part of the conversation, ask questions to test our hypotheses about what is important about that, or just ask.
So you brought up something that is so meaningful to me. If you think about people who just speak, and what's coming out, what you just said, is that they're actually just saying what they're thinking. And if you can hear that and hear what's real, instead of when somebody takes a pause and chooses their words more carefully to be kinder, that's actually edited, right? Like, so.
Well, yeah, it's really, I mean, and I want to take the pause out of it, because I do think that probably if I'm pausing, if I'm in an argument, and I mean, Stephen Covey talks about this, listening to understand versus listening to for ammo, for these war metaphors. You started that. I know
it's so natural that I'll type them in a text and then I'll rewrite them. I can't send war metaphors.
Edit myself as I'm talking here. Yeah. But I mean, if you're listening really to truly understand another person, you're listening with a different kind of ear. And when we take a pause, and somebody's asked us a really important question, like, as you hear yourself talk about this movement towards peace, what would be the place to begin this exploration? The client may stop and pause, but it's not because they're editing their thoughts. It's because they're coalescing their thoughts.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Now,
right. So that's different. It's when you're responding to somebody versus you're explaining your story. Very different editing. Yeah. Important. Yeah. Any advice, I don't know, advice come off the top of your head that you could offer in terms of listening? I mean, you've done so much studying and practice in teaching around listening. Can you give us a couple of pieces?
Yeah, if I were to give anybody any advice around listening, I mean, this is something I recommend to coaches and new coaches and old coaches and pretty much all coaches. I would recommend this to therapists also. I don't think therapists often do enough of this, which is record your conversations and then run them through a transcription program and actually start to highlight what your client said. Because I think so often, now it's a little different if you're not recording yourself, because sometimes when we're we're recording ourselves, we're on hypervigilance and we want to do it perfect, and we get into a little bit of
measured
performance.
Has changed.
Yeah, but I really think that starting to record yourself doing your work is probably the best way to begin to tune your ears to actually listening deeply to the things that the person is offering you. And the lovely thing about this is it really spreads. The more that I start to learn to listen, the more I'm not listening for an argument, but rather listening to understand, the more that I expand that out to everywhere. So a little kid comes to me with their Barbie or their Ninja Turtle or their Game Boy or whatever the heck it is that broke. I'm really hearing the distress. And so I'm going to be like, yeah, I'm really hearing the distress. And then I can have a conversation about like how disappointing things are, and then what do we want to do about it? Like, what are some solutions? Well, you could buy me a new one. That might not be the first solution, right?
What other options are there?
Yeah. What other options do we have? And we maybe need to both agree on it before we come to one that works for both of us. And so in that way, we're really having an actual conversation, in this case with a kid or with our partner. I mean, how many arguments do we have with our partners that really come out of our assumption of intention and assumption of meaning?
And also what we think we heard.
Well, that's exactly it. The assumption of meaning and the assumption of...
And the words themselves, but an assumption of meaning, both super important. Yeah.
Yeah. And so how do we think more, I guess I'm going to just take this back to that idea of, nature. In nature, there's often a mutuality that is happening for the benefit of both, right? Like bees and flowers, that's to benefit both. I think I was reading about the banyan tree, and it's a fig. It's in the family of figs, and there's a fruit that it creates that is symbiotic with a particular wasp that not only does the wasp pollinate it, but the life cycle of the wasp starts within the fruit of the tree, right? And so there's this sort of symbiosis, but I really like the idea more of mutuality. We're both benefiting. It is the win-win.
Thank you for throwing all that great language in there. We got the win-win and the win because the whole world wins, and the banyan tree and the symbiosis. You're amazing. So keep going. Sorry.
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, and I think, that it is, I think nature has so much to teach us. I know for myself, I live in a forest, and I chose that on purpose because I live outside of Seattle. So it's not like I couldn't have a city experience if I wanted one. And I've had city experiences before, but I really wanted to live in a forest. I really wanted to be surrounded by trees and nature and have that experience of, not that I live in one with nature because I live in a house and, and I'm an American. So I do all those kinds of things that we do, create a patio. And sit
but
outside.
That gets you closer to nature.
But I get to listen to the birds, and I get to hear like the little Douglas squirrel alerting to a hawk. I get to hear these different things that
only
are
because
part
you're listening.
Of the world. And it's an opportunity to listen. And it was really interesting when COVID hit, not when COVID hit, but when it became really apparent that things were going to change for a while. My husband got furloughed he'd just gotten a brand new job too. So it was like really ridiculous timing for us. But he gets this brand new job. He's there for 2 weeks. COVID measures come in and he is like furloughed. So he doesn't have a job. So he's not working. And this is a person who had been 22 years in the military. And before he retired he had like 3 months leave or something like that for his retirement. So he starts working another job 3 months before he's even truly finished the other one. And I mean, we've maybe taken a 1 or 2 week vacation a couple of times in 27 years, but not very often. And all of a sudden he's got a month. And not only is it a month that he has off, it happens to also be the most beautiful March I've ever experienced in the Pacific Northwest. So the weather was just perfect. And there was no traffic because nobody was going to work. And we would sit out in the morning, and we have like a little patio with some chairs, and we're surrounded by rhododendrons, and they were all blooming because it was March. And we could just hear the bees, and there were hundreds of them. But that sort of being in that space of really being present with the experience of those bees. And just the sound and the birds and
I'm
the
picturing it
frogs.
all.
Yeah.
And I'm hearing it all. I'm like with all my senses, like just getting by listening really carefully, I'm like stepping in and just feeling the experience as close as I can from your, wow. So it reminds me of the banyan tree where you've got this community that's created that is not broken up by technology or, human construction or whatever, roads or whatever. You've got this world that's created inside this canopy.
Yeah.
And it's the energy you just used, and the language was so positive. It was so expansive. It felt like there was this curiosity and creativity and empathy and care and all that good positive energy. They came out of this community that was created in the kind of thing that was like a canopy of a banyan tree, the world of your forest that had been created.
Well, and aren't banyan trees really like social gathering spaces also? Yeah. I mean, they provide shade, I think one of the things that was so fascinating was how they don't just build a root system. Their limbs, like their roots will drop out of their limbs and create like a whole new tree that's coming up. So it's like a multiverse almost of a tree, right? Like all these different trees that are all interconnected because they're really all the same tree in its various expressions. And I think that that's one of the things that I think is so fascinating is that it's really no different for human beings in the sense that, we don't have roots that come off of our limbs, but we have...
Well, we sort of do. We have family trees, and we
do have family
different
trees.
things that we're involved in. And
and I think there is that. And I also think, though, that we are so much more complex and interesting than we sometimes give each other credit for. And if we can sit in curiosity with other people, if we can, instead of coming from a position place, but rather an open, curious place, and leverage the language that the person is using to really hear and understand them and their mental construct of the world, of the universe, whatever, we have an opportunity to connect.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
And to look for the connection versus the difference, right? Like we're always like, the natural, sadly human behavior on listening is often, okay, you told me your story. Now I'm going to tell you yours. Not connected. I can't wait to tell you yours that's even better, right? Like to one up you as opposed to yes and connection story.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
It's beautiful. So what are your favorite nature metaphors?
Oh, goodness. I thought about this one. I mean, honestly, we talked about some of this. I mean, wind often is perceived as like movement and freedom and, and I think I love metaphors around sun. Personally, I think, the sun is shining on me,
just
that kind of
warm.
experience. Yeah, you get that somatic experience of the warmth. I honestly, if I were to have a favorite metaphor for nature that I've ever heard from somebody, it really is this, we cross a river by feeling the stones. And for me, that was so resonant to me, mostly because I've spent time up in Alaska and I've gone fishing in rivers my whole life because my dad liked to fish. And so what are you going to do? Go fish with your dad. I've also done like canoeing and kayaking. And so there's been these places in rivers so I feel a lot of affinity for this idea of the flow of a river. I also think too, like I notice the times when I'm most frustrated frustrated is often when I'm in the middle of mental flow and somebody, like, all of a sudden, like, a tree falls into my river and I have to figure out how to get around it. Water is very good. I used to, in anger management, one of the metaphors that we used as sort of a mantra was be the water. Because the water always gets where it's supposed to go or wants to go. It may go over, it may go under, it may carve out a whole new channel. It may do any number of things, but it's not going to just stop and then just just go away. It's going to do something. It may sink underground and create an underground river. You may not see it, but the water just keeps moving. It's always moving. And so, like, for me, water is a very important nature metaphor, which is probably why I resonated so much with the metaphor when the client brought that forward in that conversation.
Yeah. And I teach this workshop that I'm teaching it tomorrow night. I taught it last weekend about, spending time grabbing onto your favorite metaphor or some of your favorites and using them more. Mm-hmm. Because the beauty of what happens in your brain when you understand that you're using a metaphor and bring about that gorgeous nature imagery, and the impact of it is so different than when you're just speaking in words.
Yeah, I mean, I think really also when you're thinking about goals for yourself, I just had a conversation with Dr. Richard Boyatzis around the neuroscience of how the importance of purpose to our goals. Like, we can't just have a goal like I'm a good leader or I'm a better parent or I'm a great spouse. Like, these are fine. I lose weight, whatever the goal is. But if it is just that, and I hate to say superficial, I don't mean it necessarily in a negative way, but it's kind of a one-dimensional goal. If we don't get to the purpose that's important about, like, what is the physical experience of being a good leader? How do you know you're doing it? What's different? What's important about that for you? If we don't construct that for ourselves or with our clients, then the goal is just maybe something that we're aiming towards, and that's good, but it doesn't stick. It's not sticky. And so, like, for me, I came up with sort of a life energetic purpose at one point in my life. And I talk about this in both of my books, I think. Well, at least two of the three, but I have a kind of a mantra that is my life purpose, which is deep belly laughs. And that sort of goal for me is so crucially important because when I get upset, the tree falls in my river and I have to figure out how to go around it, often with technology, I can laugh at it instead, because that is ultimately the goal that I always move back for. And it helps to keep me in more of a balanced mental state when things may take a turn for the worst and require a adjustment to my expectations or my mindset or something like that. And so again, it kind of goes in, this isn't the banyan tree, but it is the river. But that sense of like being in the flow of that energetic state. And so when I work with executives or I work with, managers or just people, we always come up with this deeper embodied goal because it's so much more important that it's something that a person really resonates with. Because then in the moment, if I'm just trying to lose weight, in the moment when I'm looking at the chocolate ice cream at the freezer section at the store, I might just go, oh, forget about it. I'm just going to get the ice cream. Like, I've been good this week. Versus I move with ease and joy in my body, right? Well, if I'm moving with ease and joy in my body, how does the ice cream fit with that? And maybe it does, and maybe it doesn't, but at least I'm at choice about something important to me.
Wow. Super, super important. Like, just to stop for a moment. And I offer the listeners to like really honestly rewind and think about setting your purpose and your goals around how you want to feel and how you want to live your life, not about some arbitrary language goal that is out there that just makes you feel shitty about yourself.
Especially since how many people come up with a resolution for the new year. And then, health clubs are like, you could just do a Google search. How often do people join gyms in January even December. And then how long do they actually follow through on that? You know, the majority.
That's literally the economic model of it.
Yeah, I think it literally is. And because people are just so like, that's what we do. I'm gonna lose weight. I'm gonna get in shape. But there isn't enough of the real purpose behind why. Like, I'm healthy for my grandchildren would be far more important than I'm getting, I'm losing 10 pounds.
Because I want to be here for my grandchildren, so that I can have these moments of joy with my grandchildren, for them and for me, whatever it takes you to, right? Yeah, as opposed to I shouldn't eat the chocolate ice cream.
Right.
And there's not enough of a connection.
Because it's so delicious, but I should do it.
Yeah. So we've had this unbelievable conversation. And other words of wisdom, just coming off your head around metaphors and anything else you want to talk about, and then tell us what you're working on now. I know that you've always got some wonderful things going on.
Well, what am I working on now? I don't really have any other words. I don't think about metaphors right at this very moment. I think we've covered a lot of them.
Thank you. Yes.
But I think, what I've been working on, what I've been excited about is I do have the Coaching with the Power of Metaphor program, and I'm really working hard to get the second level figured out so that I can, so that people can then continue. And I've been working on how to create that program and then get the CCEUs for people who need continuing education credits, and get all that submitted. So that's kind of my focus, and really thinking about the follow-up book also to how we listen to language and how we use that to partner more fully with other people.
Yeah, I was just looking for your book, which is in the other room.
I'll show it.
Show it, and just for a moment, give us.
Now, mine's got all my stickies in it. Oops, I just dropped
So does mine, actually. I have the same yellow Post-its. But just talk for a moment about light up. It's like an incredible metaphor.
So, for me, light up was just like the right metaphor for this idea of lighting up our brain, because that's what I was seeing when I was looking at these different fMRIs and EEGs and all the different sort of ways that people are looking at people's minds. And I thought, this is important. And I wanted to really also light up the idea that this isn't just bunk that I came up with, but that there's a real science to the value of listening to people's words and to using them and to playing with them. I guess my last sort of little thing is just and you had mentioned it earlier, and I think we got sort of off on a different topic, but this idea of, there are difficult things that we need to talk about. And if we look at them through the lens of maybe a really full plate or a storm on TV, we're creating the clarity of distance that creates the psychological safety to explore it. Not I'm in the middle of the whirlwind, but rather I'm observing the whirlwind, right? And so I think it's really crucial that we're listening, but also that we're looking at it towards what the person wants and creating the psychological safety so that we're exploring whatever that scary thing is through the lens of where it's taking us and the purpose that it offers us so that we can move in the direction that we want to go. Yes. And so I guess that's kind of what I'm very excited about as I think about directionality, and I think about not just visual metaphors, but somatic metaphors, and really this idea of how do we really embody the way that we're exploring our own selves and the people that we work with and that we love.
Yeah, I can't wait. It's beautiful. I have to say the book, I was lucky enough to be in Lyssa's certification program while she was finishing her final edits of the book. So we got to use the book and then give our thoughts on the book. And I would say that, although it's intended directly for coaches, and if you're a coach, or any sort of therapist or anyone who works with people, just go out and push go on Amazon right now. But I think it's a book, and all the content, as you said, it's about listening, is for everyone. Yeah. If we all understood how to listen better and grab onto what the other person is more deeply saying, than what we think we heard, and to have more of a conversation about that, we would be in a very different place.
Yeah. If we were more curious, I think, to your point.
Curiosity, totally. The banyan tree, broaden and build, more curious, more creative. We can't get much more creative than the metaphor world.
So interconnected. We just are so interconnected. There is so much more that is binds us than there is that separates us.
Beautiful. Thank you. It was a beautiful way to wrap it up. Thank you, Lyssa. It's been such a joy. Anytime I get to spend with you, it's just magical. And thank you for sharing yourself with us all.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you, Lyssa.
This has been a production of BLI Studios, produced by me, Kai. Follow along with our other BLI produced shows at balancinglifesissues.com/podcast-BLI. Got an idea for the show? Email me, Kai, at balancinglifesissues.com. And don't forget to stay in touch with your host, Jessica, at jessica@winwinwinmindset.com. Anything else to add, Miles?
Yeah.